All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today, we're going to mix it up a bit. We're going to talk about a German theologian that still has a very important impact on post-Kantian thought and many other German thinkers. And I'm joined today by Dr. David Congdon, who is a author and speaker and is a scholar working in the areas of theology and culture. Dr. Congdon is the senior editor at the University Press of Kansas, where he oversees the publishing program in political science, law, U.S. history, Native American and Indigenous studies. His latest books are Varieties of Christian Universalism, exploring four views, published in November 2023 from Baker Academic, and Who is a True Christian? Contesting Religious Identity in American Culture, published in April 2024 by Cambridge University Press, as well as, and this is why he's here today, the author of The Mission of Demythologizing Rudolf Bultmann's Dialectical Theology, Rudolf Bultmann, a companion to his theology and the God who saves, a dogmatic sketch. So I'm excited that we have a multiple author on Bultmann to discuss his theology and thought and life today. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Congdon.
Thank you for having me.
So first and foremost, perhaps you could introduce who Rudolf Bultmann was and why you think his theological work is important for contemporary theological and philosophical studies today.
Sure. Rudolf Bultmann was a New Testament scholar who is famous for his program of demythologizing, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. He was a form critic. So the period of form criticism is a method of reading, interpreting the Bible that was pioneered in the late 19th century and kind of peaked in the early 20th century. Bultmann was one of the key developers of that criticism, that form of criticism, specifically with respect to the New Testament. He also was a founding member of the School of Dialectical Theology, and that school began basically in the 1920, 21, in that period, and lasted through the early 30s, as a school of thought, at least. And so he's important both for New Testament studies as well as for systematic theology. And part of what makes him such an important and significant figure is the way that he was pioneering in both disciplines, something that is difficult, if not impossible, to do today. His systematic theology is the lens by which I read him and why I got interested in his work, since I was trained in systematic theology. And that's the part of his work and his legacy that I think remains especially relevant today. His New Testament scholarship, as important as it was, and it was, in many ways dominant throughout much of the 20th century, has certainly lost its relevance for that school, for that field at least. It's quite outdated in that sense, but his theological work remains profoundly relevant and in many ways still is waiting to be explored in its fullness. I think there's a lot to be done with his work on that front that remains to be done. My first book was an effort to sort of start that conversation anew. For a long time, his theology and his work was associated very heavily with Heidegger, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, later. But part of what I've tried to do in my work is kind of rescue Bultmann from that association and to show that there's a lot more to him than simply existentialist concepts. So there's a lot about his work that is just really interesting. And so I think that's partly what I want to kind of highlight, is just that he has an unexplored depth to his writing and his work that I think theology can still learn a lot from.
No, that's a great answer. And this is why I have this series to highlight these important thinkers that maybe sometimes get marginalized within the tradition. I really like that you brought up this idea that you want to separate him from Heidegger. I do have a question on Heidegger today, but maybe we can talk about that differentiation between the two thinkers. And I'm also excited to hear more about your research as well too. So.
Mhm.
Could you give us a brief biography of Bultmann's life?
Sure.
Doesn't have to be extensive. Maybe just highlight the main points or main events.
I mean, I could say a lot about his life, but I'll try to hit the high points here. He was born in 1884. He was a pastor's son. He was also the grandson of a missionary who was born in Sierra Leone. So there's a deep family connection there to the church and to kind of missionary work. He was a precocious and culturally sophisticated child. He was reading Greek and German literature at an early age. He would go to the theater, go to concerts. So he was really invested in culture and arts from the early point of his life. In college, he studied theology at the three leading universities for that field, Tübingen, Berlin, and Marburg. And it was at Marburg that he would encounter his most important influences, in my view, at least Johannes Weiss and Wilhelm Hermann. He completed his doctorate thesis in 1912. He then taught at a couple universities, Breslau and Gießen, for several years before he returned to Marburg in 1921, and that's where he would spend the rest of his career. He made that university synonymous with his own school of thought for much of the 20th century, mid 20th century. Um, it was at Marburg that he met Martin Heidegger, and we'll say more about him later. Uh, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the German Christian movement in the early 1930s was a key turning point in his life. Bultmann had been close friends with Jews from an early age, and he was adamantly opposed to Nazi policies from the start. In 1933, he was the public face of the opposition to the policies that excluded German Jews from government work, and he was an active member of the Confessing Church, which began in 1934. In 1941, he gave his famous lecture on demythologizing that was given to a group of Confessing Church theologians. And then in 1951, he visited the United States for the first time on a lecture tour. That was when the debate about demythologizing was at a peak globally. And he returned to the US in 1959 as a visiting professor at Syracuse. And then he died in 1976.
Well, it seems like he had a very productive life, but also courageous, to step up
Mhm.
against. Um, there are a lot of theological thinkers, some of them that were opposed to the National Socialist regime. So it's very interesting. Um, who do you think were Bultmann's main um, theological and philosophical influences? And how do you think he employs these influences through his body of work?
Mhm. Yeah, so the two I mentioned, Johannes Weiss and Wilhelm Hermann, would be the two main influences. I'll say a bit more about some other ones, but the reason why I mentioned those, so Weiss was a New Testament scholar. He was the original developer of form criticism about the New Testament, and what Weiss did, what's really important about Weiss, if you know anything about him, he was the person who helped recover the apocalyptic eschatology of the New Testament. So what his key work, his early was a argument that Jesus's proclamation about the kingdom of God was not about, the social community of the church, as a lot of liberal theologians had said in the 19th century, but rather it was an actual expectation of a future coming of God's reign and kingdom, supernatural event on earth that was going to end world history, inaugurate a new era, all those things that a lot of the rational liberal theologians thought was absurd. And Weiss's argument was, well, I mean, it is absurd, but this is what Jesus was saying, and we have to take it seriously for what it was historically. Weiss himself, rejected it, but he at least acknowledged that was the view of the time. And that was really important for Bultmann. Bultmann's work was shaped by this eschatological understanding of the New Testament. The thing that made Bultmann so significant, and reason why his work was so influential, was that he figured out a way to make that eschatology relevant for today. What he did, and this is what leads us into demythologizing, was to recognize that while the literal views about eschatology and apocalyptic in the New Testament are no longer valid for us today, eschatology itself can be rethought in other ways, specifically for Bultmann in existential ways. So less about the coming future and more about the transcendent reality of God in breaking into our lives as in the existential moment of our everyday existence. So that was Bultmann's way of kind of developing Weiss's legacy about the New Testament, but in a theological way that remained connected to everyday concerns of Christians. Wilhelm Hermann was a theologian, a systematic theologian at Marburg, who in many ways was the initial kind of pioneer of dialectical theological thinking. And so a lot of the theology that Bultmann develops has antecedents in Hermann's thought. Hermann was he was a theologian working in kind of this post-Kantian period where he really wanted to hold on to both the transcendent otherness of God, but also this kind of personal connection to Christ in faith. He kind of balanced this dialectic between the otherness of God and the nearness of Jesus, and this kind of relationship between myself and this transcendent reality. And Bultmann really took that to heart and really developed that more systematically in his work. He found ways to connect that with his New Testament scholarship, and that's what made his work kind of unique. So those are the two twin kind of main influences. I think there are a few others that are worth mentioning. Certainly, we have to mention Karl Barth. Karl Barth was lifelong friend slash maybe frenemy of Bultmann. Well, Barth was the originator of dialectical theology. So he's the one who really got that school up and running because of his commentary on Romans that was published first in 1918 and then in 122. And that commentary on Romans, especially the second edition of it, was the one that really galvanized this new wave of theological work. And Bultmann was enamored with it, and really got on board with what Barth was doing. The two of them collaborated a lot in those early years, and kind of formed a school of thought along with Edward Turnuysen and Friedrich Gogarten. The two of them fell out in some other ways down in the 30s and 40s. I mean, they remained friends and respectful colleagues, but they had a lot of differences, especially as Barth turned in other ways in his theology. Another influence would be Adolf Harnack. Harnack was the church historian of Christianity at Berlin. Harnack was the liberal theologian at the time. He was the reigning kind of like figurehead of German theology. Harnack was deeply influential for Bultmann in the sense of the emphasis on history and historical research and the importance of always grounding our theology and our philosophy in historical reality, in historical research. And Bultmann always took that to heart. For him, church history was another way of doing theology. And those two things were not separate disciplines for him. So it was always important to keep the historical research in view as we think about how we think about faith. And of course, then there's Heidegger, of course. I mean, Heidegger comes into the picture in the mid-20s, and they become fast friends and really close colleagues. And I think we can talk more about that separately, but he would, of course, would be an important influence. I think there's one other person I want to mention, and that is Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas was a student of both Bultmann and Heidegger, who he was also a Jew, a Jewish thinker. Or why he's an influence on Bultmann, even though he's a student of Bultmann, is that in the 1930s, when he was doing his dissertation, he was doing it under Heidegger, but he quickly realized that Bultmann was the more helpful influence for him in many ways because he wanted to do work on the Gospel of John, and he wanted to do work on Augustine, these Christian texts or biblical texts and Christian texts, and Bultmann was the one who really helped get Jonas published. And then when Hans Jonas had to emigrate during the Nazi period to the United States, initially to the Europe and then the United States, Bultmann was the person who kind of really helped kind of remain in contact with him, remain friends with him. Heidegger, of course, Heidegger's pro-Nazi affiliation was created a rift both with Bultmann and with Jonas. Bultmann and Heidegger broke off contact for years, and same with Jonas. So there was a sense in which Bultmann was there was a mutual affinity and connection there that was a mutual influence. But it was Jonas's work that really got Bultmann to think more critically about the Gospel of John and how it could be read in an existentialist way. And that's what led to Bultmann's John commentary. That was probably his magnum opus, I would say. So.
Can I just ask one kind of follow-up question?
Mhm.
By existential reading of the book of St. John, what do you mean by now I'm not a theologian.
Mhm.
I have a lot of affinities with theology through my work on Schelling and this
Mhm.
idea of a kind of personalized Christ. So a lot of the images that you're bringing up and concepts are very resonant with me. But what do you mean by this kind of existential reading of I guess the New
Yeah.
Testament?
Well, specifically regarding John, one of the things that was happening in this period is this work on Gnosticism that was very important to this period. Now, so um, Bultmann was also very influential in the formation of Gnostic studies. He drew on some of the history of religions work that was being done by some predecessors on early Gnostic Mandean literature, some of that material. And Bultmann was the one who kind of helped kind of saw these connections between Gnosticism and the New Testament. But it was Jonas. So Jonas's early work was on Gnosticism, and he became very famous for this later on. Also, when he wrote Gnosticism in English later on, but his early work was on Gnosticism. And one of the things that Jonas was doing was to see how an existentialist reading of Gnostic ideas could help connect to the Gospel of John. And so, specifically, what that means is Jonas and Bultmann read the Gospel of John as in some ways an existential reworking of Gnostic ideas. So whereas Gnosticism, in their view, posited an ontological divide between those with knowledge and those without knowledge, right? Between the us and the them, in which you had a kind of a fixed separation of natures between two different groups. Um, Jonas and Bultmann, following Jonas, read John as um, uh, existentially reworking that. So instead of there being two separate groups, that those with knowledge and those without knowledge, instead that dialectic was done internally. The light, children of the light and children of the dark, children of knowledge, children of falsehood. That was an existential internal distinction. In other words, I could be somebody who is with knowledge, of the light, but I could also be somebody who is without knowledge, of the darkness, in terms of whether I respond to the decision of faith, whether I respond to the inbreaking of Christ's reality in the world, right? And so the Gospel of John, as they read it, was a rejection of Gnosticism in order to assert the deeper truth, which is that we are all faced with this existential decision and challenge from the beyond to respond and answer that call.
Thank you very much for that. It's wonderful talking to someone who has so much knowledge, but also passion about a thinker. You can see, it in your face, like your face lights up when you talk about Bultmann. So that's
Mhm.
very that's awesome. Um, Now we had talked about Heidegger, and I apologize for bringing up Heidegger again.
Mhm.
So this
Yeah.
question is just on their dialogue and maybe how their two things, maybe how their thought is differentiated. So Bultmann became friends with Heidegger in Marburg, as you stated. Could you say something about their friendship and dialogue? And do you think this dialogue and friendship influenced one another in their own works? And how do you see them as separate thinkers? Well, we don't have to talk about Heidegger, but
No,
how,
we can't. Yeah, sure. Well, there's a lot to say here. The relationship between Boltzmann and Heidegger is it's often exaggerated and it's prone to misunderstanding. So I'm going to try to parse this out as carefully as I can. Um, so as I mentioned, Heidegger came to Marburg in 1923, and that was 2 years after Boltzmann had already been appointed to his position at Marburg. So in some ways, Boltzmann was thus the senior member compared to Heidegger on this faculty. Um, what's interesting about this is that Heidegger had already actually cited Bultmann in his University of Freiburg lectures 1920, 1921, before they had even met. So, Heidegger already had recognized Bultmann as an expert and as a, leading thinker in his own right already, right by that point. And when Heidegger arrived in Marburg, one of the very first things he did was he sat in on Bultmann's seminar on Paul's ethics. And in fact, Bultmann had actually asked Heidegger to lecture twice in that seminar in February 1924. The two of them went on frequent walks along the river in Marburg. They shared a lot of ideas. They exchanged manuscripts with each other. Um, Bultmann invited Heidegger to lecture on the concept of time to the group of theologians at Marburg in July 1924. And then in October of that year, the two of them read the Gospel of John together on Saturday afternoons. Um, Bultmann attended Heidegger's lecture series on the history of the concept of time during the summer term of 1925. So the two of them are just constantly in each other's orbits. They're reading each other's work, they're listening to each other's thoughts. Um, and so the two of them developed their ideas about the relationship between theology and philosophy simultaneously in conversation with each other. Um, there's a great deal of reciprocity. And I would argue that Bultmann is as much an influence on Heidegger as the reverse, and maybe even more so. Um, at the same time, it's also important to point out that Bultmann's core ideas were already in place by 1920, before he had met Heidegger. So while Bultmann certainly ended up adopting new language in conversation with Heidegger, it would be a mistake, I think, to think that this language fundamentally changed his theology in any significant way. The kind of the core direction of his thinking and his theology was largely determined already before the two of them had ever met. Um, that being said, we can see some of the fruit of their exchange, especially during the years 1927 to 1930. That's kind of the high point. So, Being in Time was published in 1927 while they were at Marburg together. That year, Heidegger gave a very important lecture called Phenomenology and Theology. He first gave it in Tübingen, early 1928, in Marburg. And in response to that, Bultmann, well, it's actually not in response, but at the same time, Bultmann was lecturing on dialectical theology for the first time, or at least in a formal sense. And he developed a long essay on the concept of revelation. These essays and these writings were kind of his development of existential theology kind of for the first time. And so there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of overlap here between Heidegger and Bultmann in terms of what they were saying about theology and philosophy. But there are also some cracks that start to appear at the same time. Um, there's a personal crack that appears when Bultmann asks Heidegger if he can publish Heidegger's phenomenology and theology essay along with his um, the concept of revelation essay. Here says, nope, he's not on board with that. And Heidegger, it's almost immediately after giving his lecture, Heidegger starts to be disinterested in that conversation with theology. He doesn't want to be associated with the theologians. For whatever personal or disciplinary reasons, he begins to kind of distance himself further and further. He then leaves Marburg in 1928, and very quickly after that, you start to see his turn away from the question of the ontology of existence towards what becomes the historicity of being, his kind of later thought, right? And at that point, Bultmann has very little interest and very little connection to Heidegger. Um, and what's important here also is that in 1929, there's a book by Gerhard Kuhlmann where he criticizes Bultmann for being too close to Heidegger. And then Bultmann writes a response to that in 1930. And that essay is very illuminating. I won't go into that in any detail here, but what's interesting about the essay is, on the one hand, he quotes, I mean, not quotes, he plagiarizes Heidegger's essay on phenomenology and theology. There's like certain lines that are taken almost verbatim from Heidegger's essay, but he then kind of twists their meaning in certain places where Heidegger's essay very clearly puts philosophy in the driving seat, in the driver's seat. He makes philosophy the main science, and theology is kind of like this nice add-on, right? Whereas Bultmann in his essay in 1930, which is sort of a response to all this, flips that situation. He kind of minimizes philosophy as only having access to these general structures of being, whereas theology actually gives access to these deeper existential questions that philosophy can't see. It's invisible to philosophy. It has no access to it, So Bultmann is here in that essay very strongly suggesting that theology operates as the superior science. It's the science that actually gives you greater access to the depths and truths and the mystery of human life. And philosophy is very limited in that regard, and that divide just becomes wider and wider as you go on, and it plays into a number of other later disputes. But anyway, so there is definitely a period of deep, close connection, rapprochement, and dialogue happening there in the mid-20s. But it falls away pretty quickly as the two of them develop their respective programs, which don't really have a lot to do with each other.
Well, thank you very much for that very rich answer, and also really highlighting the differences and also some connections as well too. I know when you have a lot of love for a thinker and they're related to some other figure, it's hard to remove them from the shadow of the other thinker. But I think you're doing a really great job of highlighting Bultmann's, also his main kind of creativity and dynamism as a theologian. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks.
What is demythologization for Bultmann, and how does it play a part in how Bultmann approaches and interprets the New Testament?
Yeah, so here we get to the the central issue for Bultmann, in many ways. I mean, there have been a lot of scholars recently who have tried to minimize demythologizing as being, oh, like it's just a later thing that he writes about later on in his life. It's not that important to him. I think that's a mistake. The word itself does not appear for Bultmann until the 40s. So it is a late concept for him. But the core idea is there from the early 20s. So what's the idea? Well, to situate that, I think we need to go back to the mid-20s and understand what Bultmann is doing with how to interpret the Bible theologically. Bultmann has this essay in 1925 on theological exegesis of the New Testament. And that's where he develops this idea, which the German term is Sachkritik. What that word means is kind of theological or content criticism of the Bible. Now, what that means is biblical text, as Bultmann understands it, is kind of witnessing to an idea or a content that is that allows us to criticize the text in light of what the message that it's trying to convey. So The text of the Bible is a carrier, a vehicle for an idea, a concept, a message, a truth, perhaps. But that truth is not the same as the text. It's separate from the text. And when we grasp that message, we can criticize the text in light of that message. Okay. So it's an internal criticism of the text itself. Now, what is that message? That's the core rub of what theology is all about. Bultmann comes up with the idea of the kerygma as that message. Kerygma is a Greek term meaning proclamation, and the versions of that word appear in the New Testament. It's just a term that could also be replaced with, gospel or revelation. The other terms for word of God is the one that Bart uses. It all means the same thing. It's something that represents the core message or idea of the Bible, of the New Testament in particular, and that when we understand what that message is, we can use it to interpret the Bible correctly. Okay, that's the broad program that Bultmann establishes in the 20s. A couple things happened between the 20s and then the 40s when he developed demythologizing. Namely, comes to understand that these texts are historically situated. Okay, so it's not enough just to grasp this message, this kerygma. You also have to grasp that the text that kerygma comes in is situated in a particular historical time and place. The word that Bultmann comes to use for that is Weltbild or world picture. But that word then names the kind of unconscious assumption that people have about the world in which they live. So you and I are growing up in a modern technological heliocentric system in which we understand that the Earth is revolving around the sun, that the stars are these gaseous balls, billions and billions of light years away, whatever. All that stuff is happening. Like we that's the world in which we live. It's very different from the cosmos that people grew up in say the first century, CE. So there are different Weltbild, different world pictures involved in our different situations. So demythologizing has two parts. The first part is a critical understanding, a critical in the sense of historical criticism, a critical understanding of the world picture of the text. Okay, so a criticism of the world picture in which that text is being written, and then a theological translation of the message from that world picture to our world picture. Okay, so demythologizing has those two parts. It's criticism of the historical situation of that text, and then a sort of a translation or extraction or a movement of that message from that world picture, recontextualizing it, resituating it within our world picture. What does that message look like if we take it out of its original world picture and put it into our world picture? Right? That's demythologizing, is that process. So it requires one, historical research. We have to historically understand what that world picture was that the text was written within. So we need to understand the culture, the politics, the social environment, the cosmological picture, the philosophy, all those historical realities of the time in which the text was written. We need to understand all that. Then, so after we do our historical work, we put on our theological hat and we do the work of translation. What was this text meant to convey at that time? And what would it look like if we were to rewrite it for today within the presuppositions of our time, under the philosophy, the science, the culture, the politics, whatever of our world. That's the challenge that Bultmann is presenting to people. He is fully aware that the Weltbild of our situation is constantly going to change. So one of the things that people misunderstand about demythologizing is they think that demythologizing is translating the New Testament into Heideggerian existentialism, right? That's what they think. That that's a mistake because it kind of collapses Bultmann's program into Bultmann's world picture. It is true that for Bultmann, he thought that Heideggerian concepts best captured the Weltbild of his context in post-war Germany, right? That's what the situation which he was writing. And he was writing for people in that situation. And in that situation, he did believe that Heidegger's concepts helped do that translation work for his audience better than the alternatives. But he was also very explicit that a next generation would have to use different concepts, would have to use different philosophies, different ways of speaking and thinking, because these things would have to be done anew for every generation. And he said that explicitly, in his writing. So one of the things that I've been, very adamant about is that demythologizing is open-ended about the concepts that are going to be used in that translation. In my own work, I have argued that we should be, and ought to use new concepts. I've done this. I've done this now with things like Alain Badiou's philosophy. I've done it with post-colonial theory. I've done it with liberation work. There's various. I also did it with intercultural hermeneutics from people like Vrogemann and Zundermeyer. So there's a lot of contemporary concepts and frameworks and theories that I think are open to being used as new vehicles for demythologizing today that would not look anything like what Bultmann was doing in the 40s and 50s, but it is an extension of his program. It's a continuation of what he was doing, but it's following the method rather than following the exact specific way in which he did it in that time. But that's a part of what I want to help people understand is that demythologizing is not a singular fixed form of interpretation that can only be done the way Bultmann did it in the mid 40s. That's a very limited kind of myopic view of what that program was about.
Unfortunately, I haven't read Bultmann, so you're really teaching me. I'm learning all of this for new. So I'll be taking a look at him and also your work as well too. I have one last final question for you that's
Mhm.
maybe multi-layered. Um, First and foremost, how did you get interested in Bolton's work? That's the first part. And the second part is, can you maybe, and I know you just kind of briefly brought it up a second ago, can you maybe discuss some of the themes of your two books on Bultmann as well too? Because I will highlight your work on Bultmann in the video description so that the viewers
Yeah.
can also take a look at your work as well too.
I got interested in Bultmann somewhat by accident. I didn't intend, well, so I had just been accepted to the PhD program at Princeton Theological Seminary, and that summer before I started, well, actually that spring, actually the spring before I started the PhD program, an article had come out by a friend of mine, Ben Myers. He wrote a piece on Bultmann's understanding of faith as self-understanding. And I read that. I showed it to my professor who I was going to study with, and he just told me, I think you should do your PhD dissertation on Bultmann. So I said, okay, that sounds good to me. I knew of Bultmann. I had come across his name quite a bit, but I'd never read him in any sort of detail at all. So I just took it as that was a good challenge, and I just agreed to do it. That fall, my very first semester in my PhD program, I had just discovered at the same time that there was a professor at the seminary who was a Bultmann expert. I had no idea. He was in the homiletics department, in the practical theology department, and so I didn't really have any interaction with him. But one of my friends said, "Hey, Jim Kay over here wrote a book on Bultmann is very well regarded, and I think you should talk to him." And I was like, "Oh, okay, sure." So I just messaged him and said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing an independent study on Bultmann with me?" And he was thrilled. He had never been asked in 20 years, to do an independent study on Bultmann. I was the first person to propose that. And so that was a life-changing moment for me. Jim has become a good friend, and really, his influence and his mentorship has brought me to where I am today. So he continues to be a mentor to me. He has read all my work, all my drafts of all my books, and it's been a great support over the years. Um, my books on Bultmann, so I have two books on Bultmann. The first two I wrote, at least two specifically on Bultmann. My very first book was my dissertation, which is very long. Um, the published book is like 940 some pages. It is an attempt to do a few things. One is to kind of finally figure out the relationship between Karl Barth and Rudolf Bultmann. What was actually going on in their relationship? What's at stake in their relationship? What did they actually disagree about? And what's the nature of that relationship? So the book is an effort to do that in large part. Um, the larger thesis of the book is that Bultmann is a dialectical theologian in his own right throughout his whole life. Uh, if you talk to Barth scholars, or at least before my book, if you talk to Barth scholars, people would say Bultmann was in that school just for a few years, but he was never really a member of that school of thought. Only Barth really is a dialectical theologian, and Bultmann sort of, was there for a bit but fell away. Um, I reject that thesis wholeheartedly and show that Bultmann remained dialectical from beginning to end. In fact, maybe even more so than Barth did. And then I show what unites dialectical theology as a school of thought. What makes that school a school? And I argue that it's fundamentally about mission. This mission of translation, the ability of the Word of God, the ability of the charisma, the ability of revelation, however you want to phrase it, the ability of that message to cross cultural boundaries, to cross historical boundaries. That's at the root of what dialectical theology is all about. And so then I develop a reading of Bultmann's demythologizing program, kind of like what I said here, as a missionary movement, as a missionary hermeneutic. That it's a way of understanding how a text or how a message can cross cultures, can cross historical situations, um, and can, take on new forms, new ways of speaking and thinking. So that's the argument of that book. It's a lot going on there, but the second book was an effort to kind of distill all that down to a bite-sized format for students. So it's meant to be kind of an introductory guide to Bultmann. So I recommend people start there if they want to read about Bultmann. That's a good kind of place to go. But it captures all the main pieces of my argument and my thought about Bultmann, but it distills it down in a way that's a little more accessible for people.
Well, I want to thank you so much for all of your very robust answers and kind of navigating us through this really, really rich and important theological thinker. And actually, you completely won me over today. So I'll be doing a lot more of the German theologians in this series as well too, because I could see how pivotal and important all of their work is. So I want to thank you for your time and for bringing him back to life for this hour that we've had with you today. So thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Christopher. Appreciate it.